On a warm spring morning in Tampa, Florida, the courthouse stood tall and silent, its stone facade casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Inside, the air was cool, the kind of cold only marble hallways and decades of bureaucracy could create. Lawyers moved with purpose, clerks clicked away at their keyboards, and the shuffle of files echoed between courtroom doors. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't. Pam Bondi entered the building with a quiet confidence. Dressed in a charcoal blazer and heels that clicked softly against the tiled floor, she carried her briefcase in one hand and adjusted her lapel with the other. She didn't need an entourage. She never had. Her presence alone had always been enough. She wasn't here to make a statement. It was supposed to be routine, just another civil hearing on a business matter. One she could argue in her sleep. No drama, no controversy. But as she walked through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3B, she felt something off. Judge Raymond Harlan sat at the bench, back straight, glasses perched low on his nose. He was known in legal circles for his sharp tone and stricter than average sense of order. As Pam approached the defendant's table, his gaze tracked her, not with curiosity, but scrutiny. And it wasn't her brief or posture that drew his attention. It was the cross. A small gold cross, glinting softly just below her collarbone. Simple, unassuming. A piece of personal faith, not a statement. But for Judge Harlan, it was something else entirely. "Miss Bondi," he said, voice calm but clipped. "Religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Pam froze, not in fear, but in disbelief. "I'm sorry," she asked gently. "You're wearing a cross. That violates courtroom neutrality. You'll need to remove it or I'll issue a fine." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the court reporter stopped typing. "A fine for a necklace?" Pam didn't react. Not yet. But something inside her stirred. Not anger. Not indignation. Just resolve. Because in that moment, what Judge Harlan didn't realize was that he had just made a very public mistake. He thought he was correcting a symbol, but what he had really done was challenge the wrong attorney. Pam didn't flinch. She didn't glance down at the cross, didn't reach for it, didn't break eye contact. Instead, she stood still, allowing the silence to settle around her like dust on old courtroom shelves. There was no outburst, no objection, just a stillness so calm it made everyone else in the room a little more aware of their own discomfort. The judge's words still hung in the air, sterile and mechanical. "Remove the cross, or I'll issue a fine." To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a minor moment, a procedural note, a request about dress code or courtroom decorum. But for Pam, and for anyone who understood the deeper implications, it was something far more significant. It wasn't about the jewelry. It wasn't even about religion. It was about control. Pam slowly set her briefcase down on the table and folded her hands over it, her expression unreadable. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. She knew these rooms. She knew men like Judge Harlan. And more importantly, she knew the law. Still, she said nothing. The bailiff shifted slightly in his seat, clearly unsure whether he should step in. The court reporter glanced up from her keyboard, sensing something she hadn't expected to capture in that morning's transcript. "And Judge Harlan?" He leaned back slightly, maybe surprised that his instruction hadn't been met with immediate compliance. Maybe curious to see if she would push back. Or maybe, just maybe, he thought she wouldn't. But what he didn't realize was that Pam Bondi wasn't new to pressure. She had argued before tougher judges, sparred with seasoned prosecutors, withstood media storms and political firestorms. But this quiet courtroom microaggression, this was different. This was personal, because it wasn't just a cross. It was a reminder of her identity, a part of who she was, not something she wore to provoke or to prove a point, but simply because it belonged there, with her. Still calm, Pam finally spoke. "Your Honor," she said gently, "this cross is no different than a wedding ring or a bracelet with a family name." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because sometimes the quietest words are the ones that echo the longest, and whether the judge realized it or not. The courtroom had already begun to shift. Judge Harlan didn't respond right away. He tapped the side of his bench with a pen, once, twice, rhythmically, as if buying time to collect his thoughts, or perhaps hoping Pam would change hers. But she didn't. She stood her ground, literally and figuratively, her hands still folded on her briefcase, the cross still resting silently against her skin. There was no threat in her posture, no aggression, only quiet conviction. The judge cleared his throat. "That's not how I see it," he said finally, his tone clipped and formal. "Regardless of intention, religious displays, however small, undermine the neutrality of this courtroom." Pam's eyes didn't waver. The courtroom waited. Even the mundane details, the buzz of a fluorescent light, the rustle of papers, seemed to pause. Judge Harlan sighed, then spoke the words that would trigger everything that followed. "I'm issuing a fine," he said, "for non-compliance with courtroom decorum." There it was, sharp and simple. The gavel struck once, not loudly, but loud enough to draw an invisible line in the room. Pam didn't blink. The fine wasn't the issue. Not really. She could pay it 100 times over without blinking. But this was about something else. Principle. Every lawyer in that room knew how fragile courtroom dynamics could be. Judges held immense power. Their words could shift the course of arguments, the tone of trials, the outcomes of entire cases. But even power has boundaries. And what Pam understood, perhaps better than anyone in that room, was that the Constitution didn't dissolve inside courtroom walls. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in that truth. Around her, the atmosphere was dense with tension. A few spectators exchanged uncertain glances. One clerk bit her lip, looking between the judge and Pam like a tennis match with no referee. Pam looked at the judge and spoke again, soft, respectful, but unwavering. "Then, Your Honor," she said, "before we proceed with the hearing, I'd like to formally object and request to have my statement entered into the record." There it was, the first move on a much larger chessboard. She wasn't fighting the fine. She was challenging the foundation it stood on. And somewhere behind the judge's stern expression, a flicker of uncertainty crept in. Because Pam Bondi had just turned a moment of silence into a declaration of war, a legal one, but a war nonetheless. Pam's words didn't ring out. They settled, soft, deliberate, unshakable. "I'd like to have my statement entered into the record." For a moment, Judge Harlan didn't speak. The courtroom was still. Too still. Not because anyone feared a shouting match. Pam didn't raise her voice, and she didn't need to. But because in that calm, respectful tone, there was something far more disruptive. Conviction. Harlan adjusted his glasses, leaned forward slightly, and narrowed his eyes at her. "Miss Bondi, I must remind you, this is a hearing regarding a business dispute, not a platform for personal grievances." Pam nodded politely. "I'm fully aware of the docket, Your Honor. I'm also aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess." The court reporter's fingers hovered above her keys, frozen for a beat, before clacking back into motion. She knew, like everyone else in the room, that this moment was no longer about a necklace. This was about precedent. Pam opened her briefcase slowly and pulled out a single document. She didn't slam it down, didn't wave it dramatically. Instead, she unfolded it carefully, almost reverently, and placed it on the table in front of her. "Your Honor," she continued, "your request, and the fine that followed, is based on a personal interpretation of courtroom neutrality. But I believe it contradicts well-established constitutional protections." Judge Harlan didn't answer immediately. His jaw was tight, his fingers curled slightly on the bench, not out of fear, but out of something more subtle, control slipping. Pam gestured to the paper before her. "This document outlines case law relevant to religious expression in government spaces, and if permitted, I'd like to walk the court through that reasoning." The bailiff glanced over, as if unsure whether to intervene. He didn't move. Judge Harlan took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "Proceed," he said finally, the word coming out more as a reluctant concession than an invitation. Pam gave a single nod and sat. The judge had assumed his word would end the discussion, but in granting her permission to speak, he had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Because now, Pam wasn't just defending herself, she was defending a principle, and she was about to do it, on the record. Pam leaned slightly forward in her chair, fingertips resting on the edges of the document she'd placed before her. There was no urgency in her tone, no tremble in her voice, just clarity, calm, precision. "Your Honor," she began, "you've stated that my cross disrupts the neutrality of this courtroom. But the law doesn't support that claim. In fact, it protects against it." She tapped the page gently with one finger. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A public school attempted to silence students wearing black armbands in protest. The Supreme Court ruled that neither students nor citizens shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. She paused, letting the quote breathe. "Now," she continued, "if students are allowed silent symbolic expression in a public institution like a school, surely an attorney wearing a personal religious emblem isn't beyond protection in a courtroom." The room had gone completely still. No shifting, no rustling. Even the judge's usual tapping had stopped. Pam turned the page. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. That case reaffirmed that the government cannot coerce individuals to remove or alter expressions of deeply held belief. Her voice remained measured, not rehearsed, but grounded, like someone who knew the terrain before her. She glanced back at the judge. "I'm not speaking. I'm not making a religious argument. I'm simply wearing something that reflects who I am. It doesn't disrupt proceedings. It doesn't sway the case. And it doesn't threaten the neutrality of your bench." A pause. "It only becomes disruptive," she added softly, "when someone chooses to make it so." Judge Harlan didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the document in front of her, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, grappling not with her tone, but with her logic. Because legally, she was threading the needle perfectly. The court reporter typed steadily now, capturing every word. The bailiff's posture had shifted. Even the clerk, who earlier looked mildly bored, was now wide-eyed and attentive. Pam folded her hands again. "I respect this court, Your Honor, but your authority doesn't supersede the Constitution, and the Constitution doesn't flinch at the sight of a cross." Another moment of silence stretched out, dense and quiet. In that silence, it was no longer Pam who was on trial. It was the judge's reasoning, and the room knew it. Judge Harlan shifted in his seat. He didn't look angry. Not yet, but his composure had frayed just slightly. The kind of subtle change that only someone with courtroom experience would notice. His shoulders sat a little higher. His jaw tightened. His fingers laced together on the bench, as though gripping a thought he hadn't figured out how to release. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice steady but firmer now. That includes setting the tone and the expectations for conduct. Pam nodded slowly. That's true, Your Honor, she replied. But authority has limits, even yours. There was no challenge in her voice, no heat, just truth, offered plainly. She could have stopped there, let the tension hang, but she didn't. Instead, she gently shifted the conversation, not with force, but with focus. You say the cross disrupts neutrality, she said, but I see attorneys in this very courtroom wearing wedding bands, family lockets, and flag pins. Are those also violations? No answer. Pam let the silence breathe before continuing. Last week, I watched a defense attorney argue a case here while wearing a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness. No one questioned it, nor should they. But what exactly makes this symbol, she gestured lightly toward the cross, less acceptable? The courtroom wasn't loud, but something had shifted. Subtle reactions, small glances, raised eyebrows, a slight murmur from the back row. Because Pam wasn't just presenting a legal argument anymore. She was exposing a double standard. And in doing so, she was forcing the room to examine something deeper. The quiet ways bias is enforced without ever being written down. Judge Harlan cleared his throat. Those are different. How? Pam asked gently. He didn't respond. She leaned back slightly, her voice softer now. It seems to me that the rule being enforced here isn't about neutrality. It's about preference. And preference, when it becomes policy, becomes discrimination. The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again. Pam didn't push further. She didn't need to, because everyone watching could see it. He was cornered, not by aggression, not by emotion, by logic, by precedent, by the quiet, unwavering pressure of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And in that moment, the unwritten rules of his courtroom began to unravel. Judge Harlan looked down at his bench. Papers neatly stacked, the gavel placed precisely where it always was. For a man who thrived on order, routine, and absolute control over his courtroom, this moment felt unfamiliar. He had expected compliance. He had expected the usual response, a quiet removal, maybe a sigh of frustration, and then a smooth return to business. Instead, he had drawn a line, and Pam Bondi had stepped over it without raising her voice, without even leaving her seat. The power dynamics had shifted, and not because she challenged him with arrogance, but because she had challenged him with knowledge. Now, he was the one under scrutiny. Pam remained still, composed, her hands now resting on her lap. She wasn't pushing. She wasn't even arguing anymore. She had presented her case. She had done so respectfully, calmly, but most importantly, publicly. Every word was on record. Every example had been heard, and every silence that followed spoke louder than any objection could. Miss Bondi, the judge said at last, his voice flatter now, less confident. I'm not trying to make this a religious debate. Pam tilted her head slightly. Then why did you make it one? It wasn't a jab. It wasn't disrespectful. But it landed harder than anything else she'd said. A few quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge stiffened. Pam leaned in just a little. Not in aggression, but in clarity. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, I've followed every rule of courtroom conduct. I arrived on time. I prepared my case. I've shown no disrespect to the court. And yet, I'm the one being fined for wearing a symbol that has no bearing on these proceedings. She paused. All I'm asking, she continued, is for a legal justification, not a personal opinion, not a preference, a precedent, a statute. Something grounded in law. Judge Harlan's gaze flickered toward the clerk's desk, then back to Pam. His hands tightened around the arms of his chair, but he said nothing, because he had nothing. Pam didn't smirk. She didn't celebrate. She just let the silence stretch, giving everyone time to absorb the truth. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was revealing what it looked like when someone in power crossed an unspoken line and got caught doing it. Judge Harlan's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time that morning, he didn't look like a man presiding over a courtroom. He looked like a man calculating an exit, one that wouldn't cost him his pride. Pam had not shouted. She hadn't made a scene. But somehow, in the quietest way possible, she had turned the tide. She wasn't challenging his authority recklessly. She was asking for justification. And that made all the difference. Because when someone asks for law, and all you have is personal discomfort, you're already on shaky ground. The judge adjusted his chair slightly. "Mark the fine as pending review," he muttered to the clerk without making eye contact. A pause. Pam raised one brow. "I'll take that as a temporary resolution, Your Honor." The judge gave a slight nod, the kind that's meant to close a discussion without admitting fault. But it didn't. The damage was done. He had drawn a line, issued a fine, stood behind it, and now he was retreating, quietly, carefully, but retreating all the same. The clerk typed quickly, her fingers no longer hesitant. The court reporter didn't even glance up, but you could feel the shift. Everyone in that room had just witnessed something rare. Pam had stood her ground, called out judicial overreach, and walked away without a raised voice, but with the upper hand. The judge tried to regain his footing, clearing his throat and rustling some paperwork as if to restart the hearing, as if nothing had happened. But the courtroom didn't reset. It couldn't. Because once power is questioned in public, it doesn't go back to silence so easily. Pam sat quietly now, poised but relaxed. She didn't need to say another word. She had said enough. And the fine? It was no longer just about her. It was about precedent, about what judges could or couldn't do with their own discomfort, about how easily power can turn to control, and how quickly that control can slip away when someone is willing to challenge it. The hearing moved on, technically, but minds were still elsewhere. The judge might have reclaimed the schedule, but he hadn't reclaimed the room. The hearing resumed. Documents were passed forward. Witnesses were named. The matter at hand, a contract dispute between two mid-sized companies, was dry, procedural, almost forgettable. But no one was truly paying attention. Not fully, because while the courtroom moved on in form, its focus had shifted in substance. The energy in the room still hovered around the earlier exchange, the kind of energy that doesn't dissipate just because a new witness is called. It lingers, quietly, persistently, like a question no one's brave enough to ask out loud. Pam, meanwhile, sat still and professional, occasionally glancing at the files in front of her, jotting down a note, responding to her client in a soft whisper. But her mind was clear, focused. She hadn't come to the courthouse to make a point. She hadn't come to spark confrontation. She came to do her job, represent her client, argue the facts. And yet, with a single sentence from the judge and a simple refusal to comply, everything had changed. Outside the courtroom, no one knew yet. The public hadn't seen it. No reporters waited in the hallway. No headlines were written. But inside that room, something had taken root. The clerk who'd looked unsure earlier now glanced at Pam with something closer to admiration. The bailiff, who had shifted uncomfortably during the exchange, now seemed at ease in her presence. Even opposing counsel, seated across the aisle, avoided eye contact with the judge a little more than usual. Pam had remained calm, respectful, controlled, but she had also drawn a line and held it, and people had noticed. That's the quiet thing about courage. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't always arrive with flags or outrage. Sometimes it sits politely in a courtroom chair, speaks clearly, and refuses to be moved. Judge Harlan continued the hearing, his voice steady, but not as firm. He followed the outline of the case, but the natural rhythm was gone. He was reading lines, not leading a room. And somewhere beneath that black robe, he knew it. Because no matter how routine the case now appeared on paper, he had lost something that couldn't be erased by the sound of a gavel. Not control, not authority, but certainty. And Pam Bondi had taken it from him. Quietly, legally, and without apology. The case proceeded, but the courtroom had changed. People were listening, but not just to the arguments about breach of contract or financial damages. They were watching, observing, waiting, because what had happened earlier wasn't a passing moment. It was the kind of exchange that settles deep into the memory of a room, that reshapes how people perceive authority and how they perceive those who challenge it. Pam sat quietly, flipping through her client's file, listening carefully to the testimony. On the surface, she appeared entirely focused on the case. But even as she engaged with the hearing, the earlier moment echoed just beneath her calm. She hadn't planned to challenge the judge. She hadn't walked in with a mission. But when the line was drawn, she hadn't stepped back. And now, that mattered more than anything else in the room. Across the aisle, her opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't spoken a word about what happened, but his silence spoke volumes. Behind Pam, two young attorneys, both observers that day, whispered quietly to each other, their eyes occasionally drifting to the cross still visible on Pam's neck. "She didn't even raise her voice," one murmured. "She didn't have to," the other replied. Judge Harlan continued the proceedings, but with less weight behind his words. There was something fragile in the way he gave rulings now, something cautious, the kind of caution that comes after a blow you didn't expect and couldn't deny. Pam, on the other hand, was unaffected because she hadn't come to argue about faith or the Constitution. But when it came to that, she knew where she stood. And more importantly, she knew where the law stood with her. Every courtroom has its moments, where the conversation on paper is not the one being remembered. This was one of them. And though no one said it aloud, everyone could feel it. Something meaningful had unfolded that morning. Something about courage and control and the quiet power of a woman who didn't ask for permission to believe what she believed. And long after the court reporter finished the transcript, long after the files were sealed and the judgment made, this moment, Pam's moment, would be the part the courtroom remembered. When the session finally ended, the usual courtroom rhythm resumed. Papers gathered, laptops shut, chairs pushed back. But it all felt slower, quieter, not because the case had been dull, but because everyone was still processing what they'd witnessed. Pam stood, gathering her documents methodically. Her client, a middle-aged business owner in a crisp gray suit, leaned in and whispered, "That was something." She gave a small smile. "Let's just say the hearing took a detour." He nodded, eyes lingering for a moment on the cross still hanging around her neck. "I'm glad you didn't take it off." Pam didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. As they exited the courtroom, the hallway was hushed but heavy, like the air before a storm breaks. A young law student trailing behind her professor gave Pam a respectful nod as she passed. She returned it, never one to bask in recognition, but she noticed. Every glance, every whisper in passing, every subtle shift in posture, it all told her one thing. The moment had landed, not just with the judge, not just with the court staff, but with the people. What had happened wasn't just about a necklace. It had become a quiet referendum on power, on boundaries, and on what happens when someone dares to ask why. Judge Harlan hadn't spoken to her again after marking the fine as pending review. He hadn't needed to. His silence spoke louder than another gavel strike ever could. He knew, and now others did too. Pam stepped outside into the Florida sun, the brightness a stark contrast to the cool tension inside. She exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of awareness. The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She'd won that moment in court, but something told her the judge wouldn't leave it alone. Power rarely retreats quietly, and people who feel exposed often try to reclaim control. Not directly, but quietly, behind closed doors, with paperwork and whispers. Still, Pam felt steady, because she hadn't broken a rule. She had held a mirror, and what the judge saw in it was his own reflection, clearer than he expected, and far more public than he'd planned. Pam didn't expect the day to follow her home. She had argued hundreds of hearings before. Some had been messier. Some had been more high stakes. This one, by comparison, should have been forgettable. But as she sat at her desk later that evening, the courtroom still echoed in her mind. The moment the judge issued the fine, the way the room had gone still, the shift, quiet but seismic, that followed. She hadn't set out to cause waves, but deep down, she knew. When you challenge power, especially in public, the ripple doesn't end at the courtroom doors. Her phone buzzed, a text from a colleague at another firm. Heard about what happened in Harlan's courtroom today. You okay? Pam stared at the message for a moment, then typed back simply, I'm fine, just a bump in the road. But she wasn't naive. She knew how these things worked. When a judge loses control in his own courtroom, even temporarily, he doesn't forget. And he definitely doesn't forgive. It's not about the necklace. It never was. It was about a perceived challenge. A woman standing calmly, refusing to yield, not with attitude, not with noise, but with law. And that kind of defiance, it sticks. Pam poured herself a glass of water and opened her laptop. Emails were already coming in. A few were case-related. One, from a former student she once mentored, simply said, What you did today mattered. That one made her pause, because she hadn't thought about it like that, yet. But now that it had started to settle in, she realized it wasn't just her in that courtroom. There were others watching, young attorneys, law students, people just finding their footing in a field that so often demands quiet compliance. Maybe she hadn't just held the line for herself. Maybe she'd reminded others they could hold theirs too. Still, she knew better than to relax. There's always a second wave. And something in the judge's eyes told her this wasn't finished. He'd backed off publicly. But behind the scenes, that's where pushback usually begins. And Pam Bondi was already preparing for it. Pam arrived at her office early the next morning. The street still quiet, the Florida sun just beginning to rise over downtown Tampa. She liked the quiet. It gave her time to think, before the emails, the calls, the demands of the day. But today, she didn't have that luxury. Her assistant Lauren was already waiting by the door, tablet in hand, face unusually serious. Pam raised an eyebrow. You're early. Lauren didn't smile. She simply handed over the device. You need to see this, she said. Pam took it without a word, eyes scanning the screen. At first, the headline didn't register. But as she read, the reality landed with full weight. Florida Bar releases statement. Following courtroom exchange. She read the body of the text slowly, each word careful, polished, and, more than anything, calculated. Judges have the authority to maintain order and decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded the right to personal expression, it is critical that all courtroom participants respect the directives of the presiding judge. We trust our legal system to resolve such matters with fairness and integrity. Pam exhaled through her nose. It wasn't an attack, but it wasn't a defense either. It was what institutions often do when something uncomfortable happens in public. They step to the middle. Neutral, polished, safe. But Pam could read between the lines. This wasn't just a statement. It was a warning. Not from the public, not from critics, but from inside her own system. A reminder that Judge Harlan wasn't handling this alone. He was already rallying the weight of institutional credibility. "They're trying to nudge you back into line," Lauren said quietly. Pam nodded. "Or make it look like I stepped out of it." She set the tablet down. This wasn't outrage. It was strategy. Quiet pressure applied in just the right place. No direct blame, no investigation. Just enough language to plant doubt in the minds of anyone watching from the sidelines. Pam leaned back in her chair. It was subtle, professional, and familiar. She'd seen it before, in politics, in litigation, in institutions that protected themselves before they protected the truth. The first signal had been sent. Now it was up to her to decide how to answer. And silence? That wouldn't be it. Pam was still processing the Florida bar's statement when Lauren spoke again. "There's more." Pam looked up. Lauren wasn't nervous, but she was careful. That was worse. She handed over a printed document, stapled neatly at the top. Pam took it, reading slowly. It was a formal notice, a disciplinary complaint, filed against her. Her name was there in black and white, Attorney Pamela Bondi, alongside a list of allegations. Conduct unbecoming of an officer of the court. Disruption of courtroom proceedings. Inappropriate challenge to judicial authority. Pam blinked once, then reread the opening paragraph. So this was how it would begin. Not through the front door. Not with confrontation. But with paperwork. Filed quietly. Framed carefully. Delivered behind closed doors. Retaliation. Dressed as professionalism. "This came through the bar portal this morning," Lauren said. It was marked urgent. Pam set the paper down and exhaled slowly. She wasn't angry, not yet, but there was a sharpness in her chest, like a wire being pulled just a little too tight. She knew this play. She'd seen it used before. When institutions feel embarrassed, they don't apologize. They reframe. They look for a way to shift the focus. Not to what was done, but to how it was responded to. Judge Harlan had lost control in front of witnesses. Now he was rewriting the narrative. He was no longer the judge who issued a questionable fine. He was the one being disrespected. And Pam? She was no longer a constitutional advocate. She was being painted as disruptive, unprofessional, a problem. "I'll need to respond in 10 days, Pam said, her voice level. Lauren nodded. If the complaint moves forward, they could open a full review. Pam tapped the paper gently. "And who handles the review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel, judges and senior attorneys. Of course, peers, colleagues, people who understood the rules and the politics." Pam sat back, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of her chair. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the message being sent to anyone who dared to push back, even when they were right. She had two choices now: respond quietly, hope it disappeared, or treat it like what it was. A coordinated attempt to silence her. She didn't hesitate. "Get me everything we need," she said. This wasn't the end. It was just the next round. Pam placed the complaint on her desk and let her eyes drift out the window. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across the office floor. It was calm outside. Serene. Inside, the opening shots of a legal chess match had just been played. She'd seen this strategy before. Quiet complaints, subtle pressure, institutional whispers. It didn't start with a headline. It started with paperwork. She leaned forward and opened her laptop, fingers moving with deliberate precision. Not to write a rebuttal. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the terrain, because what was happening now wasn't just legal. It was political, reputational. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about control. Control over the narrative, over the optics, over her. Lauren entered again, holding a second folder. "Press requests are starting to come in," she said. "Mostly local. A few national outlets are asking if you're planning to speak publicly." Pam raised her eyebrow. "Already?" Lauren nodded. "Word spreads fast, especially when the bar issues a statement within 24 hours. Pam gave a small smile. "They're trying to make it look like a routine procedural review. Nothing personal." "But it is," Lauren said softly. Pam didn't answer. She didn't have to. This wasn't just a review. It was a recalibration, an attempt to tilt the scales back in the judge's favor after a very public stumble. And the only way to protect him was to paint her as the problem. Pam clicked through her case history, rereading the judge's exact language from the hearing transcript. She highlighted the words, "Religious symbols have no place in this courtroom." And just below it, "Remove it or face a fine." That was her foundation. Not emotion, not opinion, just facts and the words of the judge himself. "I'm going to need the audio from that day," she said. "I already pulled it," Lauren replied. "And I flagged the key timestamps." Pam nodded. "Good. We're not writing a rebuttal. We're building a record. Because if they wanted to turn this into a disciplinary case, then she was going to turn it into a spotlight. And she would make sure everyone watching could see exactly what was happening, not just to her, but to anyone who dared to push back. Pam had spent years in courtrooms, years reading between the lines, of testimony, of motions, of silence. She knew when something was routine and when it wasn't. This complaint? It wasn't about courtroom decorum. It was about power preservation. And if Judge Harlan thought she was going to handle it quietly, bury it under formalities, and hope it faded from memory, then he hadn't been paying attention. Pam didn't fight with volume. She fought with strategy. And now, it was time to make a move. She picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and tapped on a name she hadn't needed to call in a long while. Lisa Reynolds, a seasoned legal journalist who didn't shy away from calling out judicial overreach when she saw it. 2 rings. "Pam," Lisa answered, her voice bright but curious. "I was just hearing something about you. What's going on down in Tampa?" Pam didn't waste time. "A judge tried to fine me for wearing a cross. I stood my ground. Now I'm facing a complaint for disrupting the court." Silence on the other end for a moment. Then Lisa's voice sharpened. "You're telling me a sitting judge is using the system to punish you for defending your constitutional rights?" Pam exhaled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa was quiet again, but Pam could hear her typing, already working, already building the outline of a story. "I want it on record before they twist it," Pam said, "before they call this professionalism, before they pretend it's about procedure. It's not." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'll run it, tomorrow, with context, with legal commentary. You'll have a chance to speak." Pam closed her eyes for a brief second. Good. Because this wasn't just about defending herself in a hearing. It was about pulling back the curtain, about letting the public see what happens when power doesn't like being challenged. She hung up, leaned back in her chair, and stared at the ceiling for a moment. They'd filed a complaint, hoping it would intimidate her, that it would convince her to shrink, apologize, quietly disappear into the system they controlled. Instead, she was about to do the one thing they hadn't prepared for, tell the truth, out loud. By the time Pam ended the call with Lisa, a quiet certainty had settled in. She was no longer on defense. She was building a case, not just for herself, but for anyone who'd ever been nudged into silence by people in power, hiding behind rules they couldn't justify. Pam didn't see herself as a hero. She didn't care for grandstanding. But this wasn't about ego. It was about truth. And she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Sunlight changes everything. She turned to Lauren, who was already 2 steps ahead. "I've started drafting a statement," Lauren said, placing a single sheet of paper on the desk. "But I figured you'd want final control over the tone." Pam read through it slowly. It was clean, professional, cautious, too cautious. She picked up a pen and began marking the margins, not to soften the message, but to sharpen it. "We don't soften truth to keep the peace," she said. "We don't get loud, but we do get clear." Lauren nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" "No," Pam said. "I want to frame it as what it is. An attack on personal rights disguised as courtroom decorum. Let's not pretend this is about conduct. If it were, they wouldn't be doing it behind closed doors." She paused. "I want this to be more than a defense. I want it to be a question." Lauren looked up. "A question?" "Yes," Pam said. "One simple question. If they're doing this to me, what are they doing to people without a platform?" That's when it clicked. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to every young attorney who'd been pressured to stay quiet, every defendant who had no idea what rights they still had, every courtroom where silent bias hid behind the word decorum. Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because the system wasn't afraid of volume. It was afraid of exposure. She finished editing the statement, slid the paper back to Lauren, and looked her assistant directly in the eye. "Let's turn on the lights," she said. And with that, a private courtroom moment, meant to be buried, was about to become a very public conversation. The next morning, Pam sipped her coffee in silence as her phone buzzed across the desk like a restless bird. Text after text, email after email, notifications stacked on top of each other. It had begun. Lisa's report had gone live at 6 a.m. Sharp, clean, measured, and devastatingly effective. The headline was bold, but not sensational. Florida judge attempts to fine attorney over religious symbol. Then files complaint after pushback. Pam scrolled through the piece. It was everything she had hoped for. Direct quotes, legal context, constitutional precedent. It told the story plainly, letting the facts do the heavy lifting. And that was the most powerful part. The response was immediate. One prominent legal commentator from a national network tweeted, "If this is true, it's a case study in how power reacts when challenged. Quiet retaliation, cloaked in procedure." A law professor from Georgetown reposted the story with a thread breaking down the constitutional protections Pam had referenced. "This isn't just about a cross," he wrote. "It's about the silent erosion of rights in places that claim neutrality." Pam's phone buzzed again, this time a message from an old colleague at the Attorney General's office. "You're everywhere this morning, and you're right." She didn't smile. Not exactly, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing the story was no longer confined to a single courtroom or a single fine. It had grown legs, it had context, and now it had attention. Lauren entered her office without knocking, holding her phone with the screen lit up. "You need to see this," she said, voice low. Pam took the phone. The Florida Judicial Review Board had issued a brief statement. "In light of recent media attention and public inquiry, we will be reviewing the conduct of Judge Raymond Harlan to determine if judicial ethics were compromised." Pam read it twice, slowly. There it was, the shift. She hadn't filed a complaint. She hadn't asked for an investigation. She hadn't needed to. All she did was stand her ground and tell the truth. And now, the system that had quietly tried to discipline her was being forced to examine itself. The ripples had reached the shoreline. And Pam Bondi? She was just getting started. It didn't take long for Judge Harlan to respond. By midday, he was standing outside the courthouse, suit crisp, expression tight, as cameras flashed and microphones angled toward him. He hadn't called a press conference, but the media had gathered anyway, and he knew better than to stay silent now. Pam watched the footage from her office, her arms crossed as the video buffered. The judge stood still, his face a mask of professionalism. But behind his eyes, you could see the weight, not just of scrutiny, but of exposure. His statement was short, too short. "I have always upheld the dignity and neutrality of my courtroom," he said carefully. "My actions were taken solely in the interest of maintaining order and fairness. I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully." Pam didn't react. She didn't need to. The brevity said everything. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a vague reference to neutrality and a quiet attempt to distance himself from the backlash. Lauren stepped into the room, holding a transcript. "It's already circulating," she said. "Legal blogs are dissecting it. Some are calling it damage control. Others aren't being that polite." Pam nodded. "He's not talking to us. He's talking to the system, hoping they close ranks before this gets worse." And she was right, because judges didn't just fear formal reprimand. They feared the perception of weakness, of bias, of being questioned by the very people they were supposed to lead. Pam turned back to her screen. The cross, still lightly visible at the neckline of her blouse, hadn't moved. The symbol that had triggered all this, it was still right where it belonged. And now, the country was watching. They weren't just following a story about a judge and an attorney. They were watching a power structure try to hold its shape in the face of transparency. Pam leaned back, eyes still fixed on the screen. "He blinked," she said quietly. Lauren looked at her. "Now what?" Pam's answer was immediate. "Now," she said, "we keep the pressure exactly where it belongs, on the truth. Let them feel what it's like when the system answers to the people for once." By the end of the day, the headlines had evolved from curiosity to critique. Pam scrolled through a legal news site that rarely touched local matters, yet there she was, front and center. The headline read, "When Neutrality Becomes Control, Pam Bondi, Judicial Overreach, and the Battle for Boundaries." It wasn't just reporters anymore. Legal scholars were weighing in. Former judges, civil rights attorneys, clergy, even commentators outside the legal world had found a place in the conversation. Everyone had an opinion, and something strange began to happen. Voices that had once been silent or silenced started to emerge. Pam received an email from a public defender in another county. The subject line read, "It's about time." The message was brief. "I was reprimanded last year for wearing a Star of David pin. No formal complaint, but I was told it made the courtroom uncomfortable. I didn't push back. I wish I had." Another message came from a law student who had attended Pam's guest lecture 2 years earlier. "I didn't know I was allowed to say no. Thank you." Pam sat still for a moment, reading those words again. I didn't know I was allowed to say no. That was the real issue, wasn't it? Not just the fine, not even the complaint. It was the idea that silence had become a strategy, that respect for the system had slowly morphed into submission, that neutrality was being used as a cloak for control. And maybe that was why the reaction had been so strong. Not because her story was unique, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. Lauren walked in with another update. "A national legal panel wants to feature you in a roundtable discussion," she said. Topic: When judicial power crosses personal boundaries. Pam gave a slow nod. Accept. She didn't crave the spotlight, but she understood its value. The more people talked, the harder it became to pretend this was just an isolated misunderstanding. This wasn't about one judge. This was about a pattern. And now that the echo chamber was cracking, Pam knew one thing for certain. Once people find their voice, they don't go back to silence. Pam stood at her office window as dusk fell over the city, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Cars passed below, the world moving as if it didn't know what had just shifted. Or maybe it did, and it was still catching up. Behind her, Lauren laid a fresh printout on the desk. "The review board has updated their schedule," she said. "They're fast-tracking their initial findings." Pam turned slowly. "That's quick." Lauren nodded. "Too quick. Feels like they're trying to manage perception more than facts." Pam picked up the paper, eyes scanning the phrasing. "A preliminary review of the incident involving Judge Raymond Harlan and attorney Pamela Bondi will be conducted to assess potential ethical concerns, with consideration given to courtroom integrity and public trust." It was clinical, cold, but she could read the subtext. They were walking a line, trying to protect the institution without denying the public's demand for answers. "They're trying to frame this as a misunderstanding," Pam said softly. "And hoping that will make it go away," Lauren replied. Pam placed the page down carefully. "Then we don't let it." She walked to her desk and pulled a notepad from the top drawer. The lines were empty, but her mind was full. She wasn't planning a press tour. She wasn't preparing for drama. She was outlining truth, measured, deliberate, undeniable. She would speak on her terms, not with outrage, with clarity, because when people try to twist a story, the best response isn't noise, it's facts. And Pam had them. She would tell her side before others rewrote it for her, before committees diluted it, before headlines moved on. And she wouldn't just speak for herself. She'd speak for the attorney with the Star of David, the student who didn't know they could say no, the quiet professionals who never made a scene but carried invisible battles with them into every courtroom. "This isn't about defense anymore," she said to Lauren. "It's about direction." Lauren watched her, understanding. Pam wasn't reacting now. She was leading. The narrative had once been theirs. Now it was hers. And she intended to tell it clearly, calmly, and completely. The next morning began not with headlines, but with silence. Pam sat alone in her office before the rest of the building stirred. The coffee on her desk had gone cold, untouched. Her phone face down, notifications piling quietly beneath it. She'd been through public scrutiny before. Press briefings, political backlash, legal challenges. But this was different, because this wasn't just about her professional decisions. It was about something more intimate, her identity. The cross she wore wasn't flashy. It wasn't new. It had been a gift from her mother, given to her the day she passed the bar. Pam had worn it into every courtroom since, not as a statement, not to provoke, but because it was a part of her. And now, that small piece of gold had been dragged into the spotlight, questioned, politicized, reframed as a disruption. She had defended it on legal grounds, First Amendment, case law, precedent. But beneath all that was something simpler. It mattered to her. And when something you hold quietly and personally is turned into a public controversy, it changes you. Pam leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of it settle. It wasn't just a battle in court anymore. It was a reminder of how quickly the personal could be reframed as problematic, how something as subtle as a necklace could become a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of the uncomfortable conversations no one wanted to have. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she checked it. A voicemail from her father. She played it. "Hey, kiddo, just saw the news. I know this isn't what you planned for your week, but I want you to remember something. You're not just doing your job. You're doing what's right. And that matters more than comfort. Proud of you. Call me when you can." Pam closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't angry. She wasn't overwhelmed. But she was tired. Not from the noise, but from knowing that even the quiet things in life weren't safe from scrutiny. Still, she had no regrets, because truth came with a price. And if her cross had become a lightning rod, then so be it. She wouldn't take it off. She wouldn't take it back. She would carry it forward. By midday, Pam was back at her desk, responding to client emails and reviewing briefs like any other day. But the atmosphere in her office had changed. It wasn't louder. It was heavier. because this wasn't something she could compartmentalize. The hearing was over. The fine had been rescinded. And yet, the story refused to close. Pam had always lived by a simple rule: argue the law, not the moment. It had served her well through campaigns, courtrooms, and interviews. But this time, the moment had forced its way into the law, and people were still watching. A journalist from a national news outlet had requested a sit-down interview. A constitutional law professor had invited her to speak on a university panel. A civil liberties organization reached out, offering support and access to their legal research team should things escalate further. It was growing. And with every hour that passed, it became clearer. This wasn't just a personal incident. It had become a case study, one being dissected in law schools, discussed on morning shows, and debated across social media. Pam opened her inbox to find a message with the subject line, "This happens more than you think." The body of the email read, "I'm a junior associate in Miami. Last year, I was told to remove a small pin with my country's flag before entering court. No one made a scene, but it stuck with me. I didn't speak up. Watching you, I wish I had." Pam sat with that for a while, because in all the commentary, legal analysis, and public reaction, this was the part that mattered most. The silent moments, the unseen corrections, the quiet removal of identity at the courtroom door. That was what this was really about. Not jewelry, not courtroom protocol, but the quiet conditioning that taught people to shrink a little, edit themselves, blend in. Pam closed the email and looked down at her hands. She wasn't on trial, but the culture around her was. And maybe this case didn't need a verdict. Maybe it just needed to be seen. Because once something hidden is brought into the light, it becomes much harder to ignore. By the time the evening news aired, Pam's story had transcended law. It was no longer just a courtroom moment or a professional dispute. It had become a cultural conversation. Something about it had struck a nerve, deeper than legal precedent, deeper than politics. It had become personal for a lot of people. News anchors on both sides of the aisle discussed it in prime time. The footage of Judge Harlan's brief statement was replayed over B-roll footage of the courthouse. Pam's calm explanation of constitutional law was clipped and shared across social platforms. But the headline that caught Pam's attention was the one that didn't try to spin it. What does neutrality really mean? That was the question, and it was the one no one seemed able to answer cleanly. Because neutrality sounds noble until it's used to erase, until it's used to silence, until it's used selectively. Pam sat on the edge of her sofa, remote in one hand, eyes on the television as a legal analyst, someone she remembered from years back, spoke calmly to a panel of commentators. "She didn't disrupt the courtroom," he said. "She disrupted comfort." And sometimes, that's what systems fear most. The quiet challenge. The person who doesn't storm the gates, but calmly asks, why are they locked in the first place? The panel nodded, some slowly, some uncomfortably. Pam turned off the TV. She had done interviews before, talking points, sound bites, media cycles. But this didn't feel like that. It felt different, less curated, more vulnerable. Because when people start attaching their own stories to yours, when they see their quiet battles reflected in your public one, everything changes. This wasn't a PR moment. It was a mirror. Lauren entered the room holding her phone. "You're trending again," she said, half a smile on her face. Pam just gave a quiet nod. "Let them talk. It's not about me anymore." And she meant it. Because no matter where this went next, whether the review board acted, whether the judge was questioned further, Pam had already shifted the narrative. Not by raising her voice, but by refusing to lower her values. And in doing so, she had made it impossible to pretend this was ever just about a cross. The courthouse looked the same, Same stone facade, same narrow hallways, same buzz of clerks, attorneys, and bailiffs moving through their routines. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Pam noticed it the moment she stepped inside. She wasn't there for a hearing that day, just to deliver a file, something routine. But as she walked past courtroom 3B, the place where everything had begun, she felt the energy change. Not in a dramatic way, not in stares or whispers, but in posture, in presence. A young female attorney passed her in the corridor. Their eyes met for half a second. No words, just a subtle nod of acknowledgement. The kind that says, "I saw what you did, and I won't forget it." Pam returned the nod and kept walking. That was the thing about stories like hers. They didn't always end in big headlines or court rulings. Sometimes their impact was quieter, but longer lasting. Because something had broken open, and when it does, you can't unsee it. She reached the clerk's desk, handed off the file, and turned to leave. But behind her, someone cleared their throat. It was the same clerk who had sat in Judge Harlan's courtroom during the hearing. She looked nervous then, but now her voice was steady. "Ms. Bondi," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Pam looked at her, giving her full attention. The clerk hesitated, then added, "A lot of us have had moments where we felt like we had to choose between being ourselves and keeping our heads down. What you did, it reminded people they don't always have to choose." Pam offered a soft smile. "You don't. And when you stop accepting that false choice, you start to shift the room." The clerk nodded, her eyes a little brighter. Pam left the building and stepped into the sunlight, the warmth landing softly on her shoulders. She hadn't planned to start a conversation. She hadn't planned to challenge a system. All she had done was refuse to step back. And sometimes that's all it takes. Not to win a case, but to remind others that they're allowed to stand up too, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. Later that evening, Pam sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the dishwasher in the background, her laptop open in front of her. The glow from the screen lit up the room more than the ceiling lights did. She wasn't working on a case. She wasn't prepping for court. She was writing something different. A short article, opinion, personal reflection, maybe both. The title came to her almost without effort. What we call neutrality might just be silence with better branding. She stared at the words for a long time before typing, not out of hesitation, but intention, because what had started as a courtroom exchange had grown into a much larger moment. And now, it was time to speak plainly, not as a lawyer, not as a headline, but as a human being. She wrote about the cross, not its design or symbolism, but what it represented to her: memory, identity, quiet conviction. She explained how easily something personal could be recast as disruptive, not because it made noise, but because it made someone in power uncomfortable. Then she wrote about the silence, the years of small compromises that legal professionals are taught to make, the things you remove, the things you don't say, the parts of yourself you quietly fold away in the name of professionalism. She wrote, "We're told to be neutral, but what that often means is be less, show less, disappear, politely." By the time she finished, it wasn't long, but it was sharp, not angry, just honest. She clicked send, submitting it to a legal editorial site that had already reached out earlier in the week. And then she sat back, letting the stillness of the room settle around her. Some precedents are written in law books. They're debated, codified, cited in court. But others live in the choices people make, in what they challenge, what they accept, and what they choose to do when the spotlight finally fades. Pam hadn't gone looking for a cause, but she had found herself in one anyway. And now, with every story shared, every message sent, every question asked, she was watching something unfold, Not a movement, not yet, but a shift, and it had started, with one fine. Weeks passed. The headlines faded, as they always do. The legal panels moved on to new cases. The social media chatter quieted. But some stories don't end when the noise does. Some settle in deeper places, places that don't need constant attention to keep growing. Pam knew this, and in her quiet way, she had made peace with it. The Florida Judicial Review Board concluded their inquiry without fanfare. No public reprimand, no dramatic fallout, just a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps the judge had overstepped. That decorum, while important, does not override the Constitution. Judge Harlan remained on the bench, but something in his demeanor had shifted. Subtle, but noticeable. More measured. More aware of how closely people were listening now. Pam hadn't set out to change him, but change had happened all the same, and that, she realized, was the real win. Not a verdict, not a retraction, but the simple fact that something that was once hidden had been dragged into the light, and it hadn't disappeared. It had stayed. She continued her work as usual. New cases, new clients, new mornings in courtrooms with different judges, different faces. But no matter where she went now, there was something different in the air. An attentiveness. A new line that people were more cautious about crossing. She wore the same gold cross each day. Not defiantly. Just normally. As she always had. The difference now wasn't the necklace. It was how people looked at it. Not as a violation, but as a part of her. And no one said a word. Not because they feared controversy, but because they finally understood the cost of misunderstanding something so simple and calling it disruption. Pam stood outside the courthouse one morning, watching a new group of young attorneys walk up the steps. Confident, nervous, eager. One of them wore a small necklace, barely visible, but familiar. She smiled, because that was how change really takes hold. Not with sweeping declarations, but with someone deciding, quietly and firmly, not to take something off, just to make others comfortable. Pam Bondi hadn't set out to make a statement, but she did. And in the end, the message was simple. The cross stays on.